Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including Ed Fuller and Gary Grossman discussing their thriller Red Deception, and that's on Tuesday, and a Women in Horror panel on Wednesday. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, North. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section and we will get to as many questions as we can. We're very excited to welcome Brad and Catherine. I want to tell you a little bit about them and then I will turn the event over to them. Brad Kessler is a critically acclaimed novelist whose work has been translated into several languages. He's the author of Lip Creek, The Woodcutter's Christmas, and Birds in Fall, which was a recipient of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He is also the author of a memoir, Goat Song, A Seasonal Life, A Short History of Herding, and the Art of Making Cheese. Brad has been awarded a Whitting, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Rome Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Lang Taylor Prize from Duke University Center for Documentary Studies. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Nation, The Kenyon Review, and Bomb, as well as other publications. Brad teaches creative writing at the MFA program at Antioch University and has lectured at, among other places, Northwestern University, Smith College, the New School University, and the Kenyon Writers Workshop. He lives on the smallest licensed goat dairy in the state of Vermont, where he makes cheese alongside the photographer and activist Donna McAdams. Catherine Bush is the author of 5 novels, including Blaze Island, a Globe and Mail Best Book in the Hamilton Reads 2021 selection, and The Rules of Engagement, a national bestseller in Canada and a New York Times notable book. Catherine's books have been shortlisted for the Trillium and City of Toronto Book Awards. Her nonfiction has been published in the New York Times, Brick, Emergence, and Best Canadian Essays. She's an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
Guelph, yes.
Guelph, and lives in Toronto and Eastern Ontario. And without further ado, I will turn the event over to Brad and Catherine.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and welcome everyone tonight. Thanks for joining us. It's the deepest pleasure of mine to be here with Brad this evening and to join him in a conversation about this really riveting and beautiful new novel, North. And so to begin, I'm going to ask Brad to read a little bit from North to set the stage for our conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Stacy. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read from the first chapter, just the first pages, May 2017. Christopher Gathrow shut his computer and pulled on boots. The blizzard wasn't due until evening, but already the skies outside looked ominous and slate blue. A foot of snow lay in the forecast, ice accumulations, whiteout conditions. The monastery would probably lose power. A nor'easter on the mountain in early May was not unheard of, but its timing could be disastrous, especially to the apples in the monastery's orchard. A sudden drop in temperature could freeze the tender tips on the apple branches and kill the blossoms before they even bloomed. The whole crop could be ruined if Christopher did nothing. He climbed into a wool sweater and watch cap. Out the window, the clouds lowered over Blue Mountain. The sky was turning a darker shade of denim each minute. It was only 1 in the afternoon, but looked like twilight. He couldn't wait much longer. He'd missed the monks' mid-afternoon prayers, nones, but hopefully return in time for Vespers. On his way out of the abbot's quarters, he switched off the lamp on his desk and hurried into the hall. Outside, wind nearly knocked him over. The unleafed woods bent and roared, bare oaks broomed the sky. Christopher hunched into the gale, hauling a roll of white row cover over one shoulder, a ladder over the other. When he reached the rise into the orchard, his wire-rimmed glasses were completely fogged, his face numb. Saplings shook in the squall, Idareds and Gravensteins, Macintoshes and Northern Spies, their branches already ornate with buds. There were over 200 apple trees in Blue Mountain Monastery's orchard. Christopher would only be able to cover a few. The monks made cider and apple butter as a way to feed themselves by the labor of their own hands. Yet cultivating anything on Blue Mountain was becoming harder each year. The winters growing too warm, the springs too cold, the weather unpredictable. The monks were aging too, growing too frail for the work. Few new vocations arrived to fill their empty seats. No one wanted to be a monk anymore in the 21st century. The long hoped for monastic revival the order envisioned never materialized. Even Father Christopher had to admit their way of life was dying. He dropped the roll of row cover on the ground and stood before a northern spy sapling. He leaned the ladder into the branches, then shouldered the roll and started to climb. Wind caught the loose end of the cloth, kited it skyward, and Christopher had to reel it in. Then he carefully unwound the fabric clockwise around the tree's crown as best he could, making a messy cocoon of its upper bough limbs. By the time he used up all the cloth, he'd managed to cover only a dozen saplings. He climbed off the ladder and stood in the road to survey his work. The saplings looked mummified or partly injured, with white cloth flapping around their crowns. His efforts might not amount to much, but at least he tried. The first snow stung his face. He warmed his hands with his breath. Then he had the sudden unnerving sense of being watched. When he turned, a towering moose was staring at him from a row. Christopher froze. The hairs rose on the back of his neck. The tall moose wobbled on thin legs a few yards away. She looked skeletal, sick, her bones jutting out beneath a ravaged hide. The moose were dying all over Blue Mountain that year, plagued by ticks, kept alive by the warming winters. Christopher had seen their ruined carcasses crawling with ticks along the monastery roads. The calves and older cows succumbed first. This one looked ancient. She could barely stand. She stared at Christopher in the incipient snow, as if asking an unanswerable question. He crossed himself and stepped back. He'd leave the moose in peace in the orchard. Perhaps she'd make it through the storm. He'd pray for her that evening at Vespers, as he prayed each night for all of creation. It seemed the only thing left for the monks to do, watch the world change and pray.
Thank you, Brad, for that beautiful, beautiful excerpt, which gives such a strong sense of Christopher's world and the world of the novel, and also, I think, a glimpse of your world. And I just want to start by saying, what a beautiful novel this is, and how alive the language is, and how propulsive a read it is also. It feels animated by a desire to create filigrees of connection. And its overriding spirit seems to be the greatest kind of care and attention to the world, the human world, our relationship to others, and the world beyond the human. And I wanted to start by asking about the idea of sanctuary, which the novel meditates on in all sorts of ways. And you describe yourself as having sought sanctuary in Vermont. So can you talk about this, your own relationship to sanctuary? And you've also spoken about it as being one of the original impulses behind the book. And I'm very curious about the book's, originating fire and urgencies.
Sure, thanks, Catherine, for the beautiful words. So I began this book around 10 years ago, and it was a response. I live next to the monks, the Carthusian monks are my neighbors. The Charter House of the Transfiguration, they're called, are right up the hill, and we hear their Vesper bells in the evening. And likewise, down the road, about 20 minutes down the road, are the monks of New Skeet, a Russian Orthodox order. And still further down the road are the Sisters of St. Mary's on the Hill, another order of nuns. And then again, over the mountain or the Weston Priory, it sort of goes on in this area in what they call the North Country, upstate New York. We're on the western side of Vermont, so we're right by sort of the Lake Champlain Valley in Albany. So this area is the North Country. Many people have come here as religious orders to find sort of this rural retreat in the mountains or in wooded areas. And it's the same reason why I moved here about 20 years ago from New York City was to, you know, grow my own food and to find this kind of Edenic place, this kind of paradise in New England, you know, on former land that was lived on by other people. So this idea of creating an enclosure is something that is very familiar to me and visceral to me because I raise goats. My wife and I raise goats, and we have to enclose in part of our land. And so I've got to thinking about the Monks Enclosure, because literally they have an enclosure around which no one is supposed to enter. And there's this weird dialectic that goes on in the monastic world between people are there to pray for the world, pray for all humanity, and yet they're closing themselves off to humanity, literally inside of an enclosure. And as a writer and as a herder of hoofed animals, it's kind of what I do, you know, in a daily life. It's like I'm here to write about the world, and yet I live in this sort of imagined Arcadia that has, you know, on land that's been stolen, essentially. So I think we all came here for sanctuary. I mean, certainly everybody that is an immigrant to the New World, to North America, South America, and especially in North America and this area, whether it's themselves or their grandparents or their great-grandparents, you know, came from this other place. And that was the idea of, you know, the founding fathers. Well, we're going to create this kind of sanctuary for Americans. You know, it turned out it was mostly, you know, white European men who were able to own land. So it's a reckoning with, so the book, to get back to your question, the book, I always wanted to set up at the monastery because it seemed like the perfect setting as a kind of almost an allegory for the United States. You know, this enclosed place filled with people that are living inside their own story. It's a religious story, it's a biblical story that they set their hours by. And it's also the way that I live my life with the goats and up here and writing my own fictions, living in my head, making my own stories. At the same time, who is left out of this sanctuary? Who is left out of the enclosure? And when I started this book, it was 2011, and you know, the refugee crisis was already exploding in Europe and Syria and North Africa. And at our own borders, you know, in Mexico. So I wanted to play those two ideas of sanctuary side by side, you know, the idea of this kind of Yankee, rural, or American, Arcadian paradise or a monastic sanctuary, and then about political sanctuary. So into that world comes this, you know, Somali woman who is looking for a place to land and can't find it in this world, in this North American world. So that was the original impulse.
Yes, I will say I feel lucky enough to have experienced something of your landscape and the mountains that surround you. So I can, you know, picture it with that particular kind of vividness. And I will just note to say that's a photograph of Donna's, Brad's wife, on the wall behind me there, which I just realized was there. So we have the monastery and Christopher and Saro, the young Somali woman who has sought sanctuary in the United States and now is trying to get across the border to Canada, and you know, lands kind of you know, spectacularly at the monastery after a car crash in the middle of a freak May snowstorm. And she's, you know, the other thing about this landscape that you note in the novel, it's a landscape through which the Underground Railroad once transported escaping slaves. And so Christopher and Teddy, the groundskeeper, the monastery, and an Afghan war veteran are trying to grapple with what to do. And you bring together these quite different characters, and they're all rooted in very different communities. And I'm really interested in how you engaged communities in your writing of this novel, the writing and researching of the novel, and how you approach research as a novelist, which is different than a documentary impulse, because you're trying to create this world on the page, and it's a different kind of knowing. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Sure. So the communities, I mean, the novel was really an outgrowth of the three communities that are here in this place where I live, that is. One is Teddy Fletcher, you mentioned. He's the groundskeeper that fought in the war in the American involvement in Afghanistan. He was a soldier who's been injured, and he's come back to Vermont after a decade or so away, back to his home place. And his father used to work on the monastery, so he steps into his shoes as the new groundskeeper there. So that's the world of my neighbors, who are, you know, Vermonters that go back several generations, you know, to the settlers in some cases, the white settlers. And so he, you know, one of the things that Vermonters, there's not a lot of opportunities in Vermont economically. So the National Guard and the Army is usually a way out of the valley or out of the mountain. And so, like, a lot of my neighbors served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and Vermont suffered, you know, per capita worse than any other state in terms of injury and death in those wars. So he was one community of people that I know here. The other community was the monks, who, you know, as I mentioned, I live next door to and have a relationship to several in the community. Thirdly, were the some new Americans, Somali refugees that started coming to Vermont in the middle of the 90s, mostly to Burlington, northern Vermont. So it was from these three communities that I, you know, imagined this fictional story. And without them, I really couldn't have done the work. I mean, I couldn't have created this. So to answer the second part of your question, which is, how does research work for me as a novelist? I mean, it's really seeding the ground. I mean, I think of it very much like in terms of agriculture in a way. It's like, in order to grow anything, you need to have a lot of compost, a lot of humus. And humus, you know, humility. Humus comes from humility. So you also need a lot of humility, which is mean you're learning from others. You're learning from these other communities, and you're turning it over in your mind continually, you know, to make this kind of soil out of which the thing can grow. So you said it's kind of not like a documentary that novelists, how does the thing become real for them? And I think it's having that seeding and that composting and that mulching and that rich, fertile thing for something to grow out of. And that's why, and one reason why I take so long as a novelist, I mean, this book took 10 years to write, was that constant sort of rumination and turning over. And I mean, the question you asked me earlier, or if not in this question, was, how do you know, what was the thing that you asked me? How do you know when it's working or when it's real?
Oh, I mean, well, I could have asked that. I think what I was asking was what a novelist needs to know and what that novelist knowing is like.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the knowing would come from when the thing that's growing out of the soil does something you don't expect and don't want it to do. When the character surprises you, or when the book surprises you or takes a turn, then it's its own thing. And I think for me, that's how I know the thing is real. Until then, it's me putting together something that's not organic, that feels like me forcing a structure on it or a structure on a character. And so that happened with Sorrow, which is, you know, I did all the research. I spoke to, you know, I had people helping me. You know, Yusuf Ahmed is a writer in Minneapolis. I had people in, you know, the U.S. Committee of Refugees and Immigrants in Colchester, Vermont. I started working with them. You know, I visited them during the Obama years, and then I only got closer to them in the last few years of working with this. And it was Laurie Stavron, a woman who works there, who looked at my work and said, something's not working here. You need to get deeper involved in this community. And she was right. So it was the involvement of the community on one hand. On the other hand, it was my own fantasies, my own ideas, which were wrong, you know. So I needed to get deeper and richer, and that's when the characters kind of came alive, and that's usually, for me, when it works.
It's fascinating, you know, the process that researching and going deeper is the way to find unpredictability that makes something live as fiction. And reading Saro's journey and her journey from Somalia and up through South America and through the Darien Gap, which, I've been reading in recent days about Haitians, for instance, traveling that same journey. And you render it in a way that's, for me as a reader, deeply, deeply convincing. And there's that energy of what feels like meticulously researched detail, but also an energy of care that I just wanted to note, that feels so important to the energy of the novel too. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of what, Zadie Smith had this essay in defense of fiction in the New York Review of Books a couple of years ago, and it was her quote about has fiction been the creator of compassion or a vehicle for containment? And so she was comparing Melville, who says, "I contain multitudes," with Emily Dickinson's presumption to fascination to presume about other people's lives. So there's this whole thing that novelists have to do, in terms of imagining other people's lives. And so how do you do that in a way that's respectful and compassionate? And I think that was, and also, why are you doing it? I mean, that was one of the reasons that I had to keep on asking myself, because I'm obviously I'm a white, middle-aged white guy, and I'm writing to a white man and another white man, Christian, and a Vermonter, and then I have this Somali woman who's Black, African, Muslim, and that becomes part of the weave of the story that Christopher has to come to terms with in his own, at the monastery, that he's facing the other. And so it's something that I had to sort of do a deep dive myself in terms of, what I was doing, and was I being a creator of compassion or containing multitudes myself. And we do have this idea of, or at least I grew up with this idea of, the novelist, the great white novelist in his cabin working out his Moby Dick, as it were. So, that concept, I had to kind of work against and not be alone as I was writing this. In the course of writing this, I had to go out into the community and be more of a, instead of a contemplative, more of an activist. And that's a dynamic that I write about a lot in North with the monastic life, how monastics are there to pray for the world and be contemplative and not be activists. And it's the dynamic that comes up with Father Christopher, is when Saro shows up at the monastery, is he going to hide behind his robes and not take her in and not break the law and not harbor her? Or is he going to turn into somewhat of an activist? And so that was the arc of kind of his story and what he decides to do in the end. And in a way, it became, my own journey in the course of writing this book. So it was like, I needed to get out of the goat pen, I needed to get out of the house. And Donna, as you know, my wife's an activist. I mean, that's what she does. And I'm the contemplative. So we have that dualism is in our own life, in our own little monastery that we live on. So, so it did force me out of my comfort zone and created this new dynamic. And there was a time when I just thought this book, I wasn't going to finish this book, or it wasn't going to get published, or I wasn't, like, it seemed like I had hit a dead end at one point after about 8 years. And it was only really with the help of this man, Abdi Rashid Hussein, who's works for the US Committee of Refugees in Colchester in Vermont, who said, okay, so after all that work, you're not going to tell our story. You're not going to, you're just going to give up. So it was at that point, it sort of became no longer about me and my book, but it felt like, okay, so I was sort of doing this with others, or in sort of allyship with others. So that's what I think kept me going, and it's what was the sort of solution in a way.
I think
That was
it's
a
so,
long-winded way of answering your question.
yeah, but I think it's so beautiful to acknowledge, that collaborative energy that comes to writing. And I mean, it's a decolonial impulse too, I think, to work against the notion of there's the contemplative, but also the individualistic writer. The writer is individual, who has their rights to a story and their copyright. And so I think we are at a moment where it is really important to acknowledge how storytelling can be collaborative. And I admire the way you've done it in this novel. And I want to come back to, oh, sir, yes, go on.
No, I just wanted to, I mean, the idea of autonomy, I think, that we're autonomous, and I mean, and that's really the theme of the monastery that Christopher is dealing with. It's like, well, no, he's not autonomous. You're not cut off, and there's a line in the book about how living in your own bubble is great, but that the problem with living in your own bubble is that any other or stranger that comes along will pop it, so that it's just easily popped. So, but I also like the idea of collective, storytelling and singular authorship. I think that's something else that I started questioning,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Good. And it's interesting to me. I've just been thinking about that whole idea of North, of sort of reframing the world, and how from where you are, the North feels like this big expanse, and where I am on the other side of the border, in a huge metropolis. The idea of North is so different. And so, yeah, it's just an interesting reframing of what North might be. But I wanted to go back. I wanted to follow up on some things afterward, but I really wanted to ask, because about this, just something else that really strikes me with the novel as notable is that you have two characters here who are deeply religious. Sarah is a devout Muslim, and Christopher, as we all know, is a Christian monk who begins life as an artist in New York. But and you're Jewish. So I'm curious what drew you specifically to writing about deeply devout people. I mean, you've spoken about it in the context of the contemplative, but these are two characters who are devout and religions beyond your own, and you as a writer are deeply inhabiting their faith. And I'm curious about your interest in doing that as a writer.
Well, I'd always been sort of fascinated by monastic life and the idea, and it fits in with the literary, Robert Frost, Thoreau, going off alone. So I think there's a bit of that literary Thomas Merton thing. But I was also, it's hard to talk about, the spiritual matters and where one lands on that, because the minute you start to talk about that, a lot of people turn off. So I'm not going to go there, but I will say that storytelling, all these people, like the monks, are living inside of a story, and what are, in the story of the Passion, if they're, and they're living in that narrative time, salvation time. Sarah is living inside, the Quran. And so I was interested in this idea. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm a Jew. So the idea of the continuities between these religions, and that they are, in some sense, a trilogy of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, and how that cycle of story is what people in Europe, people in Asia, people in North Africa live by. I mean, those are the stories that they live by. So, and one of the things that I'm suggesting in this book, or playing with, is the idea that you can only find sanctuary. Like, maybe sanctuary doesn't exist on the land. Maybe it only exists inside of a story or inside of a book. I mean, Sarah says that at one point, that the only safe place for her is inside the pages of a book or inside of a story. So narrative, in a sense, being the place where you find sanctuary. And so I think that was my way into talking about these three religions, or two religions, Christianity and Islam. And of course, Muslims share the Christian prophets. So there's a continuity. They know about Jesus, they know about Abraham, they know about Isaac. Those people are most Islamic prophets as well. So they know Christian stories, but the Christians don't know their stories. So part of the story was Christopher having to meet Sorrow halfway and learn a little bit about her religion. I don't know if that sort of skirts your question about spirituality or religion or not.
No, I think it answers it. I mean, I think, again, one of the energies of the novel is that it juxtaposes these two religions. And there's a moment that really stands out for me where Sorrow is confronting a statue of the Virgin Mary and, puzzling over why Christians are worshiping a woman wearing a hijab. Do I have that line right? I mean, that's basically the idea. And so, that it's making a subtle but pointed point there. And Christopher's own journey, to learn more about a world that he knows nothing about, and we follow him through that. I'm curious there's a beautiful moment that you touched on before this conversation where Christopher decides to make bread, make Somali bread. And I'm curious, actually, just going back to research, if you did that yourself. Yeah, I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I attempted it. I didn't, it wasn't very, well, it was fairly successful, but not very successful. But yeah, that was part of the research was, bread was kind of a theme, but yeah.
I wanted to turn back, to the question. I mean, it's a quote that we've shared, and I just wanted to bring it forward from the British Pakistani writer Kamala Shamsi, author of the novel Home Fires, and she grew up in Pakistan in the 80s and lives in the UK. And it's from her essay, The Storytellers of Empire, published in Guernica in 2012. And I just think it's an interesting route into the discussion about, your choice and the challenges of writing a character like Sorrow. And Shamsi says, the moment you say a male American writer can't write about a female Pakistani, you were saying, don't tell those stories. Worse, you're saying as an American male, you can't understand a Pakistani woman. She's enigmatic, inscrutable, unknowable. She's other. Leave her and her nation to its otherness. Write them out of your history. So again, you make Sorrow character and you deeply inhabit her point of view, and which is a challenging thing to do and a challenging thing to do at this moment. And so I wonder if you can just take us a little more inside the doubts, the necessity, the journey of that process.
Yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it was it required a lot of work, and it required a lot of self-reflection about why, what was my need in this, what were my desires, what were my fears, doing this sort of deep dive, and coming out the other end of, talking to a lot of people and being involved in community helped a tremendous amount. And somewhere along the line, you had sent me that Kamala Shamsi quote, and I read all her books, and that gave me, it was a little light of like, yeah, of course. I mean, you have to cross borders. I mean, writing novels are all about crossing borders, the border of consciousness from the writer to the reader. It's all about inhabiting another person's skin. So it's a matter of, again, back to the Zadie Smith, how do you do that? Are you going to put yourself in their shoes, which is usually the definition of empathy? And putting yourself in someone's shoes, turns out, is kind of a violent act. You're like occupying someone's shoes, putting yourself into their, and so somewhere in the last few years, it was, I did this program, Harvard program in refugee trauma, and I learned a tremendous amount in that program about, what refugees went through and what they're continuing to go through, and the sort of emotional and traumatic effects of displacement. One of the things I came across with the help of people in this program was this concept of not empathy, but interpathy. And it's a word that the theologian David Augsburger came up with, I think, a few decades ago. And I wrote it down because I'm always forgetting what it is, but it's the intentional cognitive envisioning of the thoughts and feeling of a truly separate other. And there was something when that word was given to me, it sort of filled a hole that I think I never knew what novelists did or what I was trying to do in imagining other people. And I think it was that it's like you have to cognitively and with difficulty imagine someone who's not yourself, and you're not putting yourself in their shoes, but you're doing the research in a sense, and that they are not you, they're other. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you introduced me to that word, because I wasn't familiar about it before, and that real distinction between the violence of just trying to put yourself in someone's shoes and acknowledging, the other and the difference. But also, when you talk about it, you put the emphasis on the labor of this act of imagining. And it seems to me so often when this discussion about who can tell whose stories takes place, it's all about rights, or theft rather than labor. And and that quality of labor seems so important too.
Yeah.
Don't know if you want to speak to that.
Well, I mean, theft is real. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. The cycles of harm that have been done through representation or misrepresentation. So you have to, or I had to come with that, into that tradition and figure out a way to how to work the trap, in a sense, that you're going to be in. And I don't know if I succeeded. One never knows if they succeeded. But I mean, money is something. I mean, who benefits? I mean, what are novels for? Who are they serving? I mean, these are questions that I have all the time now. I mean, I used to have them, but now I have them even more so. It's come to the fore of, why, what good is the novel?
Can you talk about your decision to donate the proceeds of this book to the Somali community? Because I think that's a really interesting decision to have taken in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, that's just that I'm fortunate enough to do that, really. And it seemed the right thing to do, that it would go to the U.S. Committee of Refugees and Immigrants in Vermont, their office, who are now facing, this influx of Afghanis at this point, but are just swamped, and they've been doing this amazing work. And part of my getting out of my room is that I'm working with them now, as much as little as I do, but I am, trying to work with them in, I guess, helping as best I can. So
we're almost at the time for audience questions. So I would encourage, people who have questions to put them in the Q&A rather than the chat. You'll see the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But you've asked already the question that I want to land on the end, but I wanted just to acknowledge and read, a beautiful quote towards the end of the novel. Christopher thinks, each seemed a separate sphere that refused to overlap, that stayed within its skin, each consciousness made strange to the other, despite their forced intimacy and physical nearness. Even at times like this, it was only the smallest section of themselves, a grudging sliver that conjoined. And so, even though these characters do come together and share something meaningful, you're acknowledging this separateness. And yet, I'm curious, what do you think the novel can do? What can fiction do? Does it have transformative power, do you think?
I don't really know, honestly. I mean, in my personal life, I read mostly poetry and nonfiction. I've I've sort of fallen out of love with the novel, and then I fall back into love with it. So it's really a love-hate relationship of a form that, I mean, I think as we've talked about before, I mean, it came about in sort of market capitalism and the printing press, and it served the landed class. And it was, sort of poked fun at that class at the same time, but it has its birth in doubt. I mean, Don Quixote is all a book about doubt, about like what's real, what's fake. So I think it was Walter Benjamin who said, the novelist has no counsel and can offer no counsel, unlike the storyteller. And so the storyteller goes back to like a folk tradition and, or an indigenous tradition or an oral tradition where there's something useful in the story. There's something like, it's like a tool that you can use. The novel just might be ornamentation, or it might just be entertainment. And so that's what I fear, the novel has been in most of the 20th century. And, maybe that's changing. I don't know.
I'm just going to argue for the novel. And for your novel, I mean, one of the things that I love about the form is that, it brings together contradictory truths and complex truths and embodies them. And, bodies bump up against each other and have to navigate their way through the doubt and contradictions and complexities of, these, they're competing ways of being in the world and doing it through bodies, through being in bodies. And
yeah.
I just think that's powerful. And also, to speak to your novel, the way you bring attention to the world beyond the human seems so important. Christopher's apple orchards, the landscape, of the North. And just as a final note, if you could talk to the importance of that world, the world beyond the human in your work as a novelist. I know you've written Goat Song, but in this novel.
Yeah. Well, in this novel, it does show up. I mean, there's a figure in the book, and I don't want to give anything away, that really inhabits and represents that world, that sort of world that's really in danger right now, which is the natural world, which is the non-human, non-verbal other, which I'm really interested in. And can the novel inhabit that world? I don't know. But I'm glad. I mean, I loved your defense of the novel and using North as a defense. I'll take it. Thank you. So do we want to do Q&As?
Yeah,
I'll hand this over to Stacy
here. Okay, Brad Michelle said that you wrote so beautifully and poetically about pastoral life in Goat Song. What, if any, similarities or crossover did you find when studying monastic life?
Wow. Rumination, I guess. That's kind of a one-liner, but yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I don't. It's maybe that's for the reader to figure out, but I don't see it. I'm sure it's there. Sorry.
Okay, Bernadette asked if there are any parallels between Birds in Fall and North, in that they both feature characters trying to make sense of and reconcile large-scale events that are largely out of their control.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly the element of the unknown and the ineffable, and the thing that's hidden, the thing that we don't see. I mean, that's kind of what I'm constantly interested in, and which touches upon the thing that Catherine just said about the non-human world. I mean, Birds in Fall is also involved in the non-human world. I mean, there's birds and their migrations and the patterns. So I think, the patterns and the migration and that's all over. I think that's all over this book. I don't know. I haven't read it as a reader, so it's hard for me to judge.
Okay.
Only as its writer.
Isabel, I'm sorry. Oh, I think you're frozen. Did you want to finish up on that? Or no, you're good.
No,
Okay.
I was done. I was done.
Okay. Isabel, who I believe is your mom, said, at what point in the writing of the book did you decide to donate the proceeds to the Somali community?
You know, when my mother gave me some money, I think that's when. Thanks, Mom.
Good answer. Bernadette would also like to know, have you been reflecting on the experiences of the Haitian immigrants traversing the Darien Gap and haven't received much support?
Well, to be honest, people who have read this book have been sending me articles about it, and I haven't read them. I just because you know this is I've known about this route. I mean, anybody who was sort of paying attention, everybody in the refugee immigration world, you know, knew that people were coming from Africa, from the Horn of Africa, from China, from Asia, that back in 2011 and 12, I mean, 10 years ago, they were flying to Central South America or finding a way through a freighter to South America, to a port, and making these epic journeys through South America, through the Darien Gap, through Central America, through Mexico, to the border, just to get to North America. And to me, that was unbelievable. I mean, it was like Thor Heyerdahl, you know, it was like these adventurers, they are the Thor Heyerdahls of today. You know, these people who have nothing, who are making these astonishing migrations just to get into the United States, you know, to have that sanctuary. So having spent years writing this book and sort of going through it, writing about what happens in the Darien Gap, which is this sort of unpassable area in Panama that people have to go through if they're going to migrate overland. It was almost like triggering to read it now as it's happening, like nothing's changed. And so now it's in the news, and I'm glad it's in the news. Now people know, oh, this is what's happening. But I've kind of kept blinders on because this just happened now.
Andrew said he's curious about Father Christopher's past in New York, having had relationships with men and women. Can you talk a bit about his sexual identity and how it may play into his decision to become a monk?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that I wasn't clear about for the longest time. I mean, I have friends, you know, through the course of this novel, I developed friendships with monks. And it's not that there's one thing or another, you know, they're straight, they're gay monks, they're bisexual monks, they're asexual monks. I had a really hard time in the early years of writing this book. The first thing I did was visit monasteries and spend a lot of time in monasteries and try to understand Christianity was something, and try to understand Catholicism. That's a whole different story, but I didn't really know what Christopher's orientation was, sexual orientation. He was basically asexual, but that didn't cut it. And it wasn't until, you know, a friend who's a writer really pressed me on it, you know, a gay writer, really pressed me on it, say, well, what, you know, he didn't say you need to do this. He just asked me, you know, the way that Andrew's asking me now, like, well, what's the story with this guy? So I really had to sort of think it through and think, yeah, I mean, this is that he's bisexual, you know, on the spectrum of bisexual, asexual, and he does have this other love, which is, you know, the love for the non-human, you know, for the divine, for you know, for agape instead of eros. You know, he loves God, you know, in his world, you know, God is the name, or I don't know if that satisfies, but.
Lisa asked, what kind of research did you do to be able to so vividly portray the voice and experiences of a character like Sorrow?
I'm sorry, the research. So other than what I touched on, which was, I mean, I started to, as I said, go up to work with this community or work with the U.S. Committee of Refugees and Immigrants back, in the Obama, like 2016. But it wasn't until I really got further involved. It wasn't until Laurie Stavrin and Abdi Rashid Hussein introduced me to this woman, Fardosa Abdo, and her son Mohammed, and her whole family, that had come to Burlington from Yemen via Romania. I mean, they had this whole epic sort of way that they ended up in Vermont. And spending weeks with them, spending weekly, we would meet. And then during the pandemic, we met over Zoom. And getting to know that family through the year, through years now, that I felt, I think, comfortable enough. Even though their story has nothing to do with Sarah, it's not, their story is not Sarah's story. Fardosa's story is not Sarah's. Mohammed's story is not Sarah. But it was more feeling grounded in an understanding a culture and understanding a way of life that I felt that, able to do, to inhabit, that person a little fuller.
Does anybody else have, oh, we got another question from Andrew. Has the recent news in Afghanistan affected your perspective in writing Teddy the Veteran at all?
No, I think it just confirms what we've all known. I mean, anybody who was paying attention for the last 20 years, that this was a war that was never going to be, won, and people were going to suffer. Americans were going to suffer, and the international community was going to suffer, and more than anything, the Afghanis were going to suffer. So it does seem to add a bookend in a way to, I mean, Teddy Fletcher's lost a leg. I mean, he's fictional, of course, but, many people did lose, a leg or more than that. So.
Great.
Dot.
Catherine, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
I guess I was just, thinking when you were talking about the Somali family that you spent time with, and just the rhythm of those visits, wondering if they've read the novel and how they responded to the novel as readers.
Yeah, so one of the first things that I did with Laurie Stavrin, who helped, who works, I think I mentioned her, and Abdi Rashid, is that we would look at chapters together. I would sort of hash it out and get the response. And then at some point, Fardosa, who doesn't speak English, Mohammed would translate, and she would give her take on, what Sarah would do, or if I had got things right, and that was, enormously helpful. And what was helpful, there was a lot that I got wrong. And so it was seeing it sort of through her perspective and her eyes that helped.
All right, we got one more audience question from Judith, who would like to know if you're already working on your next book.
Oh God, isn't this enough? No, I'm sorry. Judith, give me a break. Yeah, I mean, I have some ideas. It's not a novel. I think I'm putting the novel aside for now, but I do have things that I've been working on for years that get put in the background. So yes.
Great. Well, Brad and Catherine, thank you so much for this great conversation. And to people who came to hear, thank you for your great questions and comments, and for coming. We really appreciate it. And don't forget to get a copy of the book from Belmont Books. And we really appreciate all of you. That's it.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Brad, for a wonderful conversation. And everybody, read this amazing book. And
read Catherine's book too, Blaze Island, which is also about the world coming to an end.
With some hope in it.
With some hope in it, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.